The morning sun cast long shadows across the empty driveway of the Harris home, where Laura stood clutching her phone and staring at the screen. No new messages. No missed calls. The house felt bigger, emptier with each passing hour that Richard remained unreachable. She'd done this routine countless times before, watching him leave for business trips, managing their beautiful Seattle home while he was away, waiting for his regular check-ins. But this time was different. This time, the silence was deafening. Their neighbors walked their dogs past the house, waving as usual, unaware that anything was wrong. The carefully maintained flower beds and freshly painted shutters gave no hint of the growing panic behind the front door. Laura paced from window to window, her normally steady hands shaking as she dialed Richard's number for the 20th time that morning. "Hey, this is Richard Harris. Leave a message and I'll get back to you as soon as I can." The familiar voicemail greeting that had once been reassuring now sent chills down her spine. Richard had built his career on reliability. As a senior account manager for a major tech firm, he handled millions in contracts with a precision that had earned him respect throughout the industry. His colleagues often joked that you could set your watch by Richard Harris. He never missed a meeting, never failed to return a call, never left a client hanging, which made his current silence all the more unsettling. Laura finally did what she'd been avoiding all morning. She called the police. Her voice cracked as she explained the situation to the dispatcher. "My husband, Richard Harris, he's missing. He was supposed to be back from his business trip to Portland yesterday evening. He always calls, always checks in. Something's wrong. I know something's wrong." The local news picked up the story within days. Richard's face, kind eyes, warm smile, the slight gray at his temples that made him look distinguished, appeared on every channel. Laura stood in front of cameras, fighting back tears as she pleaded for information. "Please," she begged, her voice steady despite her apparent distress. "If anyone has seen Richard or knows anything about where he might be, contact the police. We just want him home safe." The community rallied around her. Neighbors brought casseroles and offered comfort. Richard's co-workers organized search parties, combing through areas between Seattle and Portland where he might have stopped. His brother David flew in from Chicago, setting up a command center in their living room with maps and timelines and lists of people to contact. But as the days stretched on, the police investigation began to uncover inconsistencies that didn't add up. Detective Sarah Martinez noticed at first small details in Laura's story that shifted with each telling. The time she last spoke to Richard changed by hours depending on who was asking. Her account of his planned route varied. And when they checked Richard's phone records, they found something odd. No outgoing calls to Laura during the trip at all. "Mrs. Harris," Detective Martinez said during one interview, her voice carefully neutral, "can you walk me through exactly where you were the night your husband was supposed to return?" Laura's response came quickly, perhaps too quickly. "I was home all evening, waiting for Richard. I made dinner, thinking he might be late. When he didn't show up by 9, I started calling hospitals along his route. I have the phone records to prove it." But the detective had already checked those records. The calls Laura claimed to have made didn't exist. It was the first thread that, when pulled, would begin to unravel the careful facade Laura had constructed. The investigation shifted focus, moving from the highways between Seattle and Portland to somewhere much closer to home. Crime scene technicians arrived at the Harris residence early one morning, their presence drawing curious onlookers from around the neighborhood. They focused their attention on the backyard, where the soil in one corner appeared to have been recently disturbed. What they found beneath that freshly turned earth would shock even the most hardened investigators. Richard Harris had never made it to Portland. In fact, he had never left Seattle at all. The discovery of Richard's body turned what had been a missing persons case into something far more sinister. The medical examiner's preliminary findings pointed to poison, specifically arsenic. The toxicology report revealed a pattern of exposure over several weeks, culminating in a final, fatal dose. This wasn't a crime of passion or a sudden act of violence. This was calculated, methodical, planned. As news of the discovery spread, the community's sympathy for Laura transformed into horror. The woman they had comforted, whose hand they had held through her apparent grief, now stood at the center of a murder investigation. Her previous appearances on local news took on a different tone when replayed. What had seemed like genuine distress now looked more like careful performance. Detective Martinez's team began to piece together a timeline that painted a disturbing picture. Security footage from local stores showed Laura making suspicious purchases in the weeks leading up to Richard's death. Credit card records revealed orders for unusual items that had no place in their normal household routine. And most damning of all, their investigation uncovered evidence that the business trip to Portland, the cornerstone of Laura's story, had been fabricated from the start. Richard's colleagues, when questioned more thoroughly, revealed that he had been working from home the week he supposedly disappeared. His calendar showed no meetings in Portland, no hotel reservations, no rental car bookings. The entire premise of his absence had been carefully constructed to buy time that had been used to dispose of evidence and craft an alibi. The neighborhood that had once been a picture of suburban tranquility became the focus of intense police activity. Officers conducted door-to-door interviews, building a picture of the Harris household in the weeks leading up to Richard's death. They heard stories of late-night arguments, of strange comings and goings, of Laura's increasingly erratic behavior. One neighbor, Ellen Thompson, remembered seeing Laura in the backyard well after midnight several times that month. "I thought she was gardening," Ellen told investigators, her voice shaking. "She told me she was planning to put in a new flower bed. I even offered to help her pick out plants. I never imagined." The investigation revealed that Laura had been methodically poisoning Richard over time, adding small amounts of arsenic to his food and drinks. The gradual buildup made him increasingly ill, but not enough to raise immediate suspicion. When he finally succumbed to the poison, Laura had her story ready. The business trip, the missing person report, the tearful pleas for help. David Harris, standing in what had been his brother's home, struggled to comprehend the betrayal. Richard trusted her completely, he told Detective Martinez, his voice raw with grief. He would have never suspected she could do something like this. None of us did. The careful image Laura had maintained, the devoted wife, the grieving widow, crumbled under the weight of mounting evidence. The woman who had appeared so distraught on television now sat in an interrogation room, her composure finally cracking as detectives presented her with the evidence of her crimes. The case captivated the public, not just in Seattle but across the country. It spoke to primal fears about betrayal, about the possibility that those closest to us might harbor the darkest secrets. The story of Richard Harris, successful businessman, loving brother, trusted friend, and his wife's calculated betrayal would become a cautionary tale, a reminder that sometimes the most dangerous threats come from within our own homes. As investigators continued to build their case against Laura, they discovered that Richard's death was just the final act in a much longer play. The truth that would emerge would prove even more disturbing than anyone had initially suspected, revealing a web of lies, manipulation, and calculated cruelty that had been years in the making. The Harris case hit close to home for many Seattle residents. In coffee shops and office break rooms across the city, conversations inevitably turned to Richard's murder. People found themselves looking at their own relationships differently, wondering about the subtle signs they might have missed in their own lives. Sarah Chun, a barista at Richard's favorite coffee shop, couldn't stop thinking about his last visit. He came in every morning for his usual, medium dark roast, no sugar. That last week, he looked tired, kind of pale. I asked if he was feeling okay, and he just smiled and said he was fighting a bug. Now I can't help but wonder if I could have said something more. The case sparked countless discussions on social media. Local Facebook groups filled with posts from people sharing their own experiences with betrayal and deception. One post from a woman named Michelle went viral. "My neighbor disappeared 10 years ago. His wife told everyone he'd run off with someone else. They never found him. Reading about Richard Harris makes me wonder if we all missed something obvious." Detective Martinez found herself fielding calls from people across the country, each convinced they knew someone in a similar situation. "It's like this case opened a floodgate," she explained to her partner. People are looking at ordinary things, a spouse's strange behavior, unexplained illnesses, sudden changes in routine, and seeing them in a whole new light. Local news stations ran special segments on recognizing the warning signs of domestic abuse and manipulation. Mental health professionals reported an increase in couples seeking counseling, citing the Harris case as their wake-up call. The story had touched a nerve, forcing people to confront uncomfortable questions about trust and intimacy. The impact rippled through professional circles as well. Companies began reviewing their policies on employee wellness checks and emergency contacts. Richard's own firm implemented new protocols for verifying business travel arrangements, determined to prevent anyone else from using work trips as cover for something sinister. At the local community center, support groups formed spontaneously. People gathered to share their fears, their suspicions, their guilt over times they might have noticed something wrong but stayed silent. The conversations were raw, honest, and sometimes uncomfortable, but they helped people process the shocking reality that had unfolded in their midst. David Harris attended one of these meetings, listening as neighbors and strangers talked about his brother's death. The hardest part, he told the group, his voice quiet but steady, is accepting that sometimes you can't see the danger, even when it's right in front of you. Richard was smart, successful, surrounded by people who cared about him. And still, none of us saw what was happening. Social media buzzed with hashtags related to the case. Hashtag Justice for Richard trended locally, then nationally. People shared photos of Richard from community events, baseball games, charity fundraisers, snapshots of a life cut tragically short. Each post seemed to ask the same unspoken question: how well do we really know the people we love? Local psychologist Dr. Rachel Martinez began offering workshops on building healthy relationships and recognizing manipulation. The Harris case scared people, she explained. It made them realize that danger doesn't always look like danger. Sometimes it wears a familiar face and lives in your home. The workshops filled up quickly. People wanted to understand how someone like Laura could hide her true nature for so long. They wanted to know what signs they should watch for in their own relationships. But mostly, they wanted reassurance that they weren't being paranoid for asking these questions. Online forums dedicated to the case attracted thousands of members. People shared their theories, analyzed Laura's television appearances, and debated the warning signs they thought they could spot in hindsight. Amateur sleuths picked apart every detail of the case, looking for lessons that might prevent similar tragedies. The conversation extended beyond just romantic relationships. Parents talked about teaching their children about trust and personal safety. Friends discussed how to check on each other more effectively. Co-workers developed informal buddy systems, making sure to notice when someone seemed off or wasn't following their usual routine. Richard's story became a catalyst for change in unexpected ways. Local domestic violence shelters reported increased donations and volunteering. People seemed more willing to get involved, to ask uncomfortable questions, to offer help even when they weren't completely sure it was needed. At Seattle Central Hospital, Dr. James Wilson noticed an uptick in patients asking for toxicology screenings. The Harris case made people more aware of subtle forms of poisoning, he said. While we don't want to encourage paranoia, being aware of these possibilities can save lives. The Seattle Times ran a series of articles examining similar cases from around the country. They found dozens of instances where spouses had used their intimate knowledge of their partner's routine to conceal murder. Each story added new layers to the public's understanding of how trust could be weaponized. Local schools incorporated discussions about healthy relationships into their curriculum. Teachers reported that students were asking thoughtful questions about trust, control, and the difference between caring and manipulation. The conversations were difficult but necessary. In coffee shops, bars, and living rooms across Seattle, people found themselves sharing their own stories of close calls and near misses. A woman named Jennifer admitted she once found rat poison in her ex-husband's garage, carefully relabeled as plant fertilizer. A man described how his former partner had slowly isolated him from friends and family, making him dependent on her for everything. These conversations, though uncomfortable, helped people process their feelings about the Harris case. They created a space where fears could be voiced, suspicions could be shared, and support could be offered. The community was learning to balance trust with awareness, love with caution. As the case moved toward trial, the public's attention remained fixed on the story. But now, alongside the horror of Richard's murder, there was a growing sense of determination. People weren't just watching the news. They were actively working to prevent similar tragedies in their own communities. The Harris case had started as a simple missing person report, but it had evolved into something much more significant. It had become a wake-up call, a teaching moment, and a catalyst for change. The question, what would you do if someone close to you disappeared, was no longer hypothetical. It was a real consideration that demanded honest answers and concrete actions. Detective Martinez sat at her desk, staring at the timeline she'd created. Something about Laura Harris's behavior wasn't sitting right. Most family members of missing persons showed signs of anxiety, desperation, even anger. But Laura's reactions felt rehearsed, like she was playing a part she'd studied carefully. "Watch this again," Martinez told her partner, Detective John Chin, rewinding the footage of Laura's first police interview. On screen, Laura detailed Richard's normal routine with mechanical precision. She knew every meeting, every phone call, every stop he typically made on business trips. But when they asked about her own schedule during the days surrounding his disappearance, her answers became vague, filled with maybe and probably. The investigation team set up in a conference room, walls covered with photos, documents, and sticky notes. They'd interviewed dozens of people, neighbors, co-workers, friends, and each conversation added new layers of complexity to the case. Several witnesses mentioned seeing Laura's car parked at odd angles in the driveway late at night, something out of character for someone known for her precise parking. "She's too cooperative," Martinez said during a team briefing. "Every time we ask for information, she has it ready. It's like she prepared for every question before we even thought to ask it." She pointed to a stack of documents Laura had provided, bank statements, phone records, Richard's travel itineraries. Who keeps their spouse's detailed schedule going back 3 months? The forensics team's preliminary findings added to the growing unease. They'd found traces of unusual substances in the kitchen, nothing definitive yet, but enough to raise red flags. The garbage disposal showed signs of recent heavy use, with scratch marks suggesting something harder than food had been ground up. Laura's behavior during searches of the house struck the investigators as odd. While most family members hovered anxiously or asked questions, she stayed in the living room, calmly reading magazines. When they asked to check the garage, she provided the key, without looking up from her book. "It's like she's trying too hard to appear normal," Chin observed. "Every reaction is exactly what you'd expect, but it feels calculated." He shuffled through his notes from the neighborhood canvas. "And listen to this. 3 different neighbors mentioned hearing arguments from the house in the weeks before Richard disappeared. When we asked Laura about it, she said they were watching TV with the volume too high." The break in the case came from an unexpected source. A rookie officer reviewing traffic camera footage noticed Laura's car heading toward the industrial district at 2 a.m., 3 days before she reported Richard missing. The timestamp contradicted her statement that she'd been home all week, worried about Richard's unusual silence. The discovery of Laura's nighttime drive sparked a new direction in the investigation. Detective Martinez obtained a warrant to check Laura's credit card records, revealing purchases that painted a disturbing picture. Hardware stores, garden supply centers, and most concerning, a specialty chemical supplier. Each transaction had been carefully spaced out over several weeks, never raising immediate suspicion. The forensics team focused their attention on the Harris's kitchen, taking samples from every surface. The results confirmed their worst fears: traces of arsenic carefully hidden among common household cleaners. Further testing revealed residue in several cooking pots and storage containers. The neighborhood witnesses began sharing more detailed accounts. Ellen Thompson, who lived next door, described a strange interaction with Laura just days before Richard's disappearance. "She asked me about my garden, specifically about pest control," Ellen told the detectives. "She seemed really interested in my old-fashioned remedies, especially the ones using natural minerals and compounds." Another neighbor, Tom Parker, recalled a conversation that had seemed innocent at the time, but now carried darker implications. Laura mentioned that Richard had been feeling under the weather for weeks. She said doctors couldn't figure out what was wrong. Looking back, she didn't seem very concerned about it. The investigation team brought in a toxicology expert, Dr. Sarah Wells, to review Richard's medical records. The symptoms described here, gradual weakness, stomach issues, Docs, they're consistent with arsenic poisoning, Dr. Wells explained. It's especially telling that the symptoms would improve when he was away on business trips, only to return when he came home. Laura's calm exterior began showing cracks as the investigation intensified. Security cameras at the police station caught her pacing in the waiting room before interviews, practicing facial expressions when she thought no one was watching. During one particularly long questioning session, she slipped and referred to Richard in the past tense weeks before his body was found. The search of the Harris property expanded to include ground-penetrating radar. The technology revealed several areas where the soil had been recently disturbed. In the garden, investigators found empty containers buried beneath rose bushes, containers that matched purchases Laura had made weeks earlier. The most damning evidence came from the Harris's home computer. Despite Laura's careful efforts to delete her search history, tech experts recovered queries about untraceable poisons, effects of arsenic, and methods for disposing of evidence. The searches dated back months, suggesting long-term planning. Detective Martinez called a meeting with the district attorney's office. "We're not just looking at murder," she explained, spreading photos and documents across the conference table. This was a carefully orchestrated plan. She created the perfect alibi, playing the role of worried wife while systematically poisoning her husband. The business trip story was just a cover to explain his absence while she disposed of evidence. The investigation had moved far beyond a missing persons case. With each new piece of evidence, the image of Laura Harris transformed from grieving widow to calculated killer. The question was no longer what had happened to Richard Harris, but rather how his wife had managed to maintain her deception for so long. The next step would be the most crucial, building a case strong enough to ensure Laura couldn't manipulate her way out of the charges. The investigation team worked around the clock, knowing that their thorough documentation of every detail would be essential in bringing Richard's killer to justice. David Harris sat across from Detective Martinez in a small conference room, his hands wrapped around a cold cup of coffee. The wall behind them was covered with photos, documents, and sticky notes, the visual representation of his brother's final months. He'd been coming to these meetings for weeks now, helping the investigation team understand who Richard really was. "I found these," David said, pulling out a stack of emails from his briefcase. "Richard and I wrote to each other almost every day. He never mentioned being sick, but reading them now." His voice trailed off as he handed the papers to Martinez. The emails showed a subtle change in Richard's tone over time, from energetic and detailed to increasingly tired and distracted. The investigation team had assembled a core group of allies who could help them understand different aspects of the case. Karen Mitchell, Richard's assistant for the past 5 years, provided detailed records of his work schedule. "Richard never missed a meeting, never forgot a client's name," she told them. "But in those last few months, he started asking me to reschedule things. Said he wasn't feeling well." The financial investigation brought in James Cooper, a forensic accountant who'd worked with the department before. He dug through years of bank records, credit card statements, and investment accounts. "Look at this," he said one afternoon, pointing to his computer screen. "Laura took out a life insurance policy on Richard 6 months ago. $3 million. She paid the premiums in cash." Dr. Emily Wong from Seattle General joined the team as a medical consultant. She reviewed Richard's medical records, focusing on his recent complaints of stomach problems and fatigue. "These symptoms, when viewed individually, might not raise alarm bells," she explained. "But together, they paint a clear picture of arsenic poisoning. The real question is why none of his doctors connected the dots." The team's strategy sessions often ran late into the night. They needed to build a case that was absolutely airtight. Laura had shown herself to be clever and manipulative. They couldn't leave any room for doubt. Detective Martinez set up a special hotline for tips about the case, and the calls started pouring in. A barista from Richard's regular coffee shop remembered Laura coming in alone, ordering Richard's usual drink multiple times over several weeks. She said she was bringing it to him at work, the barista recalled. But Mr. Harris hadn't been in for a while. Said coffee was upsetting his stomach. Richard's old college roommate, Mike Sullivan, flew in from Boston to help. He'd known both Richard and Laura since before they were married. Richard changed after the wedding, he told the investigators. Became more isolated. Laura always had a reason why they couldn't make it to group events. Said Richard was too busy or too tired. The investigation gained another unexpected ally in Laura's former co-worker, Sarah Jensen. She came forward with stories about Laura's odd behavior in the months leading up to Richard's death. She asked me weird questions about my husband's life insurance policy, Sarah told Detective Martinez. Wanted to know how much coverage was typical. At the time, I thought she was just being practical. The team set up a dedicated space in the precinct, nicknamed the War Room. The walls became a timeline of Richard and Laura's relationship, from their first meeting through their final days together. Photos, receipts, text messages, everything that could help them understand how a seemingly normal marriage had ended in murder. Detective Chen focused on Laura's digital footprint, working with tech experts to recover deleted emails and browser history. They found a pattern of late-night searches about untraceable poisons, arsenic levels in the body, and how to fake business travel records. She was methodical, Chen reported. Used private browsing modes, but didn't realize the routers still logged the sites. The team brought in Dr. Marcus Reed, a forensic psychiatrist, to help them understand Laura's psychology. What we're seeing here is a level of planning that suggests this wasn't a crime of passion, he explained, studying Laura's interviews. The performance she put on for the cameras, the careful construction of her alibi, these indicate long-term premeditation. David spent hours helping the team understand Richard's routine, his habits, the small details that made up his daily life. He always called Mom on Sundays, he remembered. Never missed a week. But those calls got shorter and shorter. He said he was just tired, but now we know why. The evidence from the Harris home kept growing. The crime scene team found traces of arsenic in the garbage disposal, in empty food containers, even in Richard's favorite coffee mug. Each discovery helped them piece together how Laura had carried out her plan, slowly poisoning her husband while maintaining her facade of the devoted wife. Text messages recovered from Richard's phone showed a man increasingly confused about his declining health. Not feeling great again, he wrote to a friend 2 weeks before his death. Laura's taking good care of me though, making all my meals, keeping track of my medicine. Don't know what I'd do without her. The investigation team worked to build a psychological profile of Laura, trying to understand what had driven her to murder. They interviewed her former classmates, co-workers, even her family. A pattern emerged of someone who was always performing, always calculating her next move. She never did anything without a reason, her former boss told them. Every friendly gesture, every favor, it was all carefully planned to get her what she wanted. I never trusted her, but I never thought she'd go this far. The team's strategy came together piece by piece. They would show how Laura had systematically isolated Richard, controlled his food and medicine, and gradually poisoned him while playing the role of caring wife. The financial evidence, the recovered searches, the witness statements, everything pointed to a calculated murder planned months in advance. As they prepared their case, David looked at the photo of his brother still pinned to the war room wall. Richard trusted her completely, he said quietly. That's what made her plan work. He never questioned why she insisted on making all his meals, why she was suddenly so interested in his schedule. He thought she was taking care of him. The team knew they had one chance to get this right. Laura had spent months planning her crime. They would make sure justice was just as methodical. The interrogation room felt smaller than usual that morning. Detective Martinez watched Laura Harris arrange herself in the metal chair, smoothing her skirt with steady hands. 2 cups of coffee sat untouched on the table between them. In the observation room next door, Detective Chen and the district attorney waited, watching through the one-way glass. "Thank you for coming in again, Mrs. Harris," Martinez began, keeping her voice neutral. She'd interviewed hundreds of suspects over her career, but something about Laura's calm demeanor made her skin crawl. "We have some new questions about Richard's case." Laura nodded, her face a perfect mask of cooperation. "Of course. Anything to help find out what happened to my husband." She'd worn no makeup today, and the dark circles under her eyes suggested sleepless nights. But Martinez noticed how her eyes kept darting to the corner of the room, calculating. "Let's talk about Richard's health in the months before his disappearance." Martinez spread out a series of medical records on the table. According to these, he visited 3 different doctors complaining of stomach problems, fatigue, and headaches. "Yes, we were very concerned." Laura's voice wavered slightly, just enough to suggest worry, not enough to seem theatrical. "The doctors couldn't figure out what was wrong. I tried everything to help him feel better, special diets, natural remedies." Martinez slid a photograph across the table. It showed an empty container found buried in the Harris's backyard. "We found traces of arsenic in this. Can you explain that?" For just a moment, Laura's composure slipped. Her fingers twitched toward the photo, then pulled back. "I don't know anything about that. We use lots of different products in the garden. It could have been there for years." "Interesting you should mention gardening." Martinez pulled out another document. "We have receipts showing you purchased similar containers from 3 different stores in the past few months. Always paid in cash. Always bought other items at the same time, plant food, fertilizer, common household items." Laura's response came too quickly. "I've been redoing our garden. Anyone in the neighborhood can confirm that. I wanted to surprise Richard with it when he got back from his trip." "The trip?" Martinez leaned forward. "Let's talk about that. We checked with Richard's company. There was no business meeting in Portland. His calendar shows he was working from home that week. Want to explain that?" The change in Laura's expression was subtle, but unmistakable. Her right eye twitched slightly, and her fingers curled into her palms. "There must be some mistake. Richard told me about this trip weeks in advance. He had all his meetings planned." Martinez opened another folder. "We found something interesting on your home computer, Laura. Searches about arsenic poisoning, about how to make it look like natural causes. The searches go back months." She laid out printed pages of the search history. "These were deleted, but our tech team recovered them." "Anyone could have made those searches," Laura said, but her voice had lost its earlier confidence. "We had guests over all the time. Richard worked from home. It could have been anyone. But it wasn't anyone, was it?" Martinez kept her voice low, steady. "We found traces of arsenic in your kitchen. In the coffee maker. In Richard's favorite mug. The same type of arsenic we found in his body when we dug him up from your backyard." Laura's hands began to shake. She clasped them together tightly, trying to maintain control. "I want a lawyer." "You'll get one," Martinez assured her. "But first, let me tell you what we think happened. You started poisoning Richard months ago. Small doses in his coffee, his food. Made him sick enough to keep him weak and confused, but not enough to raise serious alarm. You isolated him from friends and family, controlled what he ate, what doctors he saw." The mask cracked further. Laura's breathing quickened, her chest rising and falling rapidly. "You can't prove any of that. We already have." Martinez laid out more photos. The garden where Richard's body was found, the evidence collected from their kitchen, the financial records showing the life insurance policy. "You planned everything. The fake business trip was just your cover story, buying time while you disposed of evidence." Laura's composure finally shattered. Tears spilled down her cheeks, but her voice turned hard, angry. "He didn't appreciate what he had. Do you know what it's like being married to someone so perfect? Always doing the right thing, always being the good guy. Everyone loved Richard. No one saw how he controlled everything, how he kept me in his shadow. So you killed him." Martinez didn't phrase it as a question. "I made it peaceful." Laura's words came out in a rush now, as if she'd been holding them back for too long. "He just got tired, went to sleep. It was better than he deserved. Do you know how many times he promised to cut back on work? How many times he said we'd travel, do things I wanted to do? But it was always about his career, his reputation." In the observation room, Detective Chun turned to the district attorney. "We got her." Laura seemed to realize what she'd done. Her mouth snapped shut, and the tears stopped as suddenly as they'd started. "I want my lawyer. Now." As uniforms led Laura away to booking, Martinez gathered the evidence photos. The confession wasn't necessary for their case. They had enough physical evidence to convict, but hearing Laura's real voice, finally stripped of its pretense, sent chills down her spine. David Harris was waiting outside the interrogation room. He'd watched the whole thing on the monitor. His face was pale, but his voice was steady when he spoke. She didn't even mention Richard in all that. Just herself. It was always just about herself. The courthouse halls buzzed with whispered conversations as Laura Harris's trial preparations began. Each day brought new revelations about her hidden life, pieces of a puzzle that painted an increasingly disturbing picture. Detective Martinez spent hours in her office, sorting through financial records that showed years of careful manipulation. "Look at this," she told Detective Chun, pointing to a series of transactions. She had a secret bank account in Nevada, been siphoning money from their joint accounts for years. Small amounts, nothing Richard would notice, but it adds up to over $200,000. The prosecution team discovered credit cards in Laura's maiden name, used for purchases Richard never knew about. Hotel stays in nearby cities, expensive restaurants, gifts sent to an address they hadn't traced yet. Each discovery hinted at a life completely separate from the one she shared with her husband. Laura's defense team tried to spin a story of emotional abuse and desperation, but their narrative fell apart under scrutiny. Interviews with the couple's friends and colleagues painted a very different picture. Richard was remembered as patient, kind, always willing to compromise. It was Laura who controlled their social calendar, who decided which events they attended, who managed their home life with increasingly rigid rules. She kept separate phones, Chin reported, dropping a file on Martinez's desk. One for her life with Richard, one for whatever else she was doing. The second one had messages going back 3 years. Different name, different persona, entirely. She called herself Claire. The prosecution's financial expert testified about the life insurance policy Laura had taken out on Richard. She'd forged his signature on the documents, using her experience handling their household paperwork to duplicate his handwriting. The policy had a double indemnity clause. It would pay double if Richard died in an accident or was murdered by someone other than the beneficiary. David spent days helping investigators understand the extent of Laura's deception. Richard thought she was taking accounting classes at night, he explained, his voice tight with anger. Turns out she was meeting someone. Had a whole other group of friends who never knew she was married. They knew her as Claire Thompson, a successful single businesswoman. The truth about Laura's double life emerged piece by piece. She'd created an elaborate alternate identity, complete with fake business cards and a LinkedIn profile. Claire Thompson was everything Laura Harris wasn't. Independent, adventurous, free from the constraints of married life. She'd even rented a small apartment across town under that name, a private space where she could be someone else entirely. In court, Laura's mask finally crumbled completely. Gone was the grieving widow, replaced by someone harder, colder. She sat at the defense table in designer clothes bought with money stolen from her husband, her face set in an expression of defiance rather than remorse. The prosecution's case grew stronger with each witness. Former colleagues testified about Laura's careful manipulation of Richard's schedule, ensuring he was too busy or too tired to notice her frequent absences. Neighbors recalled seeing her leave the house late at night, returning hours later in different clothes. The most damaging testimony came from a man named James Porter. He'd known Laura as Claire, dated her for over a year. "She told me she was divorced," he said on the stand, unable to look at her. Said her ex-husband had been controlling, that she was finally living life on her own terms. "I had no idea Richard was still alive." Laura's defense team tried to paint her actions as a response to a suffocating marriage, but their arguments fell flat against the mountain of evidence showing her calculated deception. Bank records proved she'd been planning Richard's death for months, perhaps years. She'd researched different poisons, studied cases where spouses had gotten away with murder, created elaborate alibis that fell apart under investigation. It wasn't enough to kill him, the prosecutor told the jury during closing arguments. She had to destroy his reputation too. Her plan was to play the grieving widow, then gradually suggest that Richard had been involved in something illegal. She wanted people to think he'd brought this on himself. David testified about finding Richard's personal journal hidden in a box of old tax records. The entries showed a man increasingly confused by his deteriorating health, worried about his memory lapses, concerned that he was letting people down at work. He trusted her completely, David told the court, his voice breaking. Even when he was at his sickest, he wrote about how grateful he was for her care. The journal entries were devastating evidence. Richard had documented his symptoms without realizing their cause, writing about the strange metallic taste in his coffee, the meals that left him nauseated, and the weakness that seemed to get better when he traveled for work. He'd attributed everything to stress, never suspecting that his wife was slowly poisoning him. Laura showed no reaction as the evidence mounted against her. She sat perfectly still, her face blank, as witness after witness destroyed the carefully constructed image she'd maintained for years. Only when James Porter testified did she show any emotion, her hands clenching into fists as her two worlds finally collided. The prosecution's final piece of evidence was a video found on Laura's secret phone. She'd recorded herself practicing her reactions to different scenarios, crying over Richard's disappearance, expressing shock at suggestions of foul play, breaking down when asked difficult questions by police. It was a performance rehearsal, complete with different variations of the same lines. Detective Martinez watched from the gallery as Laura's carefully constructed world collapsed. The woman who had played the role of devoted wife so convincingly now sat alone, her true nature exposed for everyone to see. The jury would see what the investigation team had discovered, not a desperate wife driven to extremes, but a calculating killer who had lived a lie for years, planning her husband's death while building a secret life with his money. Some people wear masks so long they forget their real face, Martinez told Shen as they left the courthouse that evening. But Laura didn't forget. She chose her masks carefully, used them to hide who she really was. That's what makes her so dangerous. The courtroom fell silent as Dr. Sarah Wells took the stand. As the prosecution's expert witness on toxicology, she would explain exactly how Richard Harris had died. Behind her, a large screen displayed chemical diagrams and medical charts, the science behind Laura's methodical murder laid bare for the jury to see. Arsenic poisoning is particularly cruel, Dr. Wells explained, her voice steady and clinical. The victim experiences symptoms that mimic common illnesses, stomach pain, headaches, fatigue. Over time, the poison builds up in the body, causing organ failure and eventually death. The jury leaned forward as she described the evidence found in Richard's tissue samples. The arsenic levels told a story of systematic poisoning over months. Higher concentrations in his hair showed clear patterns, spikes of exposure followed by periods of recovery when he traveled for work. Laura sat motionless at the defense table, her face a careful mask of indifference. But her hands, clasped tightly in her lap, showed white knuckles as Dr. Wells continued her testimony. Based on the toxicology reports, Mr. Harris was given a final, fatal dose approximately 48 hours before his death. This dose was significantly larger than the previous exposures. It would have caused intense pain, disorientation, and eventual organ failure. The prosecutors stepped forward. In your expert opinion, Dr. Wells, could Mr. Harris have been unaware he was being poisoned? Yes, absolutely. Arsenic is nearly tasteless when mixed with food or drink. Given the gradual exposure pattern we see here, Mr. Harris would have attributed his symptoms to a chronic illness. The periodic improvement when he wasn't home would have only added to the confusion. The evidence mounted as more experts took the stand. A forensic accountant detailed Laura's financial manipulations. A computer specialist showed the jury Laura's deleted search history, revealing months of research on untraceable poisons and murder methods. Detective Martinez watched from her seat behind the prosecution table, noting how Laura's composure slipped slightly with each new revelation. The careful persona she'd maintained was cracking under the weight of irrefutable evidence. The trial's momentum shifted dramatically when the prosecution called their final witness, James Porter, the man who had known Laura as Claire. His testimony destroyed any remaining sympathy the jury might have had for her. She talked about her freedom, Porter said, unable to look at Laura. Said she was finally living the life she deserved. I didn't know she was talking about killing her husband. The prosecutor presented emails Laura had sent to Porter, discussing future plans while Richard was still alive. She'd written about traveling together, starting a new life, using money she claimed was from a divorce settlement, money that would actually come from Richard's life insurance policy. Laura finally took the stand in her own defense, against her lawyer's advice. She'd spent days preparing, but the practiced responses and carefully crafted explanations fell apart under cross-examination. Mrs. Harris, the prosecutor began, can you explain why you purchased arsenic under 3 different names? It was for the garden, she replied, her voice steady, but her eyes darting to the jury. I told you before. And the secret apartment? The false identity? Were those for gardening too? Laura's composure cracked. You don't understand what it's like, she snapped. Being married to someone like Richard. Everything had to be his way. His career, his schedule, his perfect life. I couldn't breathe. Yet financial records show Richard supported your every interest. He paid for your classes, your hobbies. He even agreed to cut back his work hours when you asked. Isn't it true that the only thing Richard ever denied you was permission to spend his life insurance money? The gallery watched in stunned silence as Laura's careful facade finally shattered completely. Years of deception and calculated manipulation poured out in a bitter tirade. He was weak, she spat. Always worried about doing the right thing, helping others, building his precious reputation. Do you know what it's like living with someone so good? Making you feel guilty for wanting more? He didn't deserve that money. He didn't deserve any of it. The jury deliberated for just 3 days. When they returned, the forewoman's voice was clear and unwavering as she read the verdict, guilty of first-degree murder. The judge's sentence came swiftly, life in prison without possibility of parole. He cited the calculated nature of the crime, the betrayal of trust, and Laura's complete lack of remorse as aggravating factors. As officers led her from the courtroom, Laura turned to look at David one last time. In that moment, her mask dropped completely, revealing the cold emptiness beneath. David met her gaze steadily, watching the woman who had murdered his brother finally face the consequences of her actions. Detective Martinez gathered her files, knowing the case would haunt her for years to come. Not because of its complexity or the challenge of proving Laura's guilt, but because it revealed how completely someone could hide their true nature from the people closest to them. Outside the courthouse, reporters pressed for comments about the verdict. David spoke briefly, his voice thick with emotion. Today we got justice for Richard. But nothing can bring him back. Nothing can undo what she did to him. 6 months after Laura's conviction, David Harris stood in his brother's office, sorting through the last of Richard's belongings. The room remained exactly as Richard had left it, family photos on the desk, sticky notes with reminders stuck to the computer monitor, a half-empty coffee mug still sitting on a coaster. We're doing something good with the house, David told Detective Martinez, who had stopped by to check on him. Turning it into a shelter for people leaving abusive relationships. Richard would have liked that. The community had rallied around Richard's memory in unexpected ways. His company established a scholarship fund in his name, helping young people pursue careers in business ethics. The program emphasized the values Richard had lived by: integrity, compassion, and dedication to doing the right thing. Local support groups used the case to educate people about the subtle signs of manipulation and control. Richard's story became a powerful reminder that abuse doesn't always look like bruises and broken bones. Sometimes it hides behind smiles and seemingly perfect marriages. David found himself speaking at awareness events, sharing his brother's story to help others. Richard didn't die in vain, he would tell audiences. If his story helps even one person recognize the danger they're in, if it saves one life, then something good has come from this tragedy. The investigation team had been changed by the case too. Detective Martinez developed a special training program for officers, teaching them to look beyond the obvious in domestic cases. Laura Harris fooled everyone for years, she explained during sessions. We need to learn from that, to look deeper, when something doesn't feel right. Richard's old coffee shop put up a small plaque in his memory. He came in every morning for 10 years, the owner said. Always had a kind word for everyone, always remembered people's names. That's the Richard we want people to remember. The scholarship fund grew beyond anyone's expectations. Companies and individuals donated, touched by Richard's story and determined to create something positive from the tragedy. Within a year, it had enough money to support 5 students annually through their entire college education. Laura's case became required study at the police academy. Detective Chen often lectured about it, using it to teach new officers about the importance of looking past surfaces. The most dangerous predators, he would say, are the ones who look exactly like everyone else. The Harris family home, once a crime scene, transformed into a place of hope. The shelter opened its doors 1 year after Richard's death, offering safety and support to those escaping dangerous relationships. The garden where Laura had buried Richard became a peaceful courtyard where survivors could find healing. David kept his brother's memory alive in smaller, more personal ways too. He maintained Richard's tradition of monthly donations to local charities. He visited Richard's favorite lunch spots, sharing stories with the staff who remembered him. Sometimes, I order his usual, David admitted to Martinez over coffee. It helps me feel close to him. The case changed how many people viewed their relationships. Support groups reported increased attendance, with many citing Richard's story as their wake-up call. People began paying more attention to subtle red flags, to the small inconsistencies that might signal deeper problems. Richard's colleagues established an ethics award in his name, given annually to employees who demonstrated exceptional integrity in their work. The first recipient was Karen, his assistant, who had helped the investigation by providing crucial documentation of his final months. The legal community used the case to advocate for stronger protections against financial abuse in marriages. Richard's story showed how easily one spouse could hide criminal behavior behind routine household management. New guidelines were proposed for monitoring large insurance policies and significant financial changes in marriages. Time passed, but Richard's impact continued to ripple through the community. The scholarship students wrote letters to David, sharing how Richard's story had inspired them to live with greater purpose and integrity. Local businesses that had known Richard created mentorship programs, helping young professionals develop not just career skills, but ethical leadership. David found an unfinished letter on Richard's computer, written just days before his death. In it, Richard had been planning a surprise for their mother's birthday. Even as Laura was poisoning him, even as his health was failing, he had been thinking of others. The letter became a testament to who Richard truly was, someone who lived for others until the very end. Richard believed in the good in people, David said at the shelter's opening ceremony. That belief might seem naive after what happened to him, but I think it's more important than ever. We honor him not by becoming suspicious and fearful, but by continuing to help others, to trust, to build something positive from tragedy. The case files were eventually archived, but Richard's story lived on. It was told in training rooms and support groups, in scholarship ceremonies and shelter meetings. It became not just a tragedy to be mourned, but a catalyst for change, a reason to look closer, care more, do better. Detective Martinez kept Richard's photo on her desk, a reminder that sometimes the most important evidence is the subtle shift in routine, the small inconsistency, the quiet voice saying something isn't right. Richard taught us all something, she would say. Sometimes the biggest dangers hide in plain sight, but so do the heroes, the everyday people who choose to do right, to help others, to make a difference.
Disclaimer: this channel does not support or tolerate any form of discrimination, racism, prejudice, or violation of human rights. The stories presented here are original and created by the author with the aim of promoting reflection, awareness, and dialogue. All content is developed with respect for diversity and the dignity of all people.